Hey everybody, Larry Powell here, your host for Studio HFL, and this is HFL number 137, and this is another in a series of interviews rather I did with local, and by local I'm referring to Indianapolis, central Indiana region, and this is with Henry Leck. Henry is the founder of the Indianapolis Children's Choir, and he's going to give us the lowdown on how this was created and how it has grown into one of the most amazing entities out there. So before we get to Henry's interview, of course, I have to tell you about the show sponsors. Messina Covers is not just any other case company. David Messina and Erica Howard design and produce some beautiful cases that fit both form and function. And you can choose your case design, fabric, and trim color, add custom engraving, and more. And of course, you can find out more at messinacovers.net. Peter Pickett and his crack team of craftspeople are continually innovating and providing the trumpet community with spectacular options for stock and custom mouthpieces. He and Eric Murine can help you find just the right size to fit your needs, and you should definitely consider trying the acrylic cup and rim. And if you're in the market for a custom trumpet, then Peter and Eric can build a Blackburn trumpet just for you. Check them out at pickettblackburn.com. To stay current on what's going on with Studio HFL, you can follow me on social media on Facebook and Instagram. And you can watch the live and pre-recorded interviews on the YouTube channel. And while you're there, go ahead and subscribe. My first experience with a Hammond design mouthpiece has turned into a bit of obsession. There is something very comfortable about playing one of Carl's mouthpieces. The comfort, response, and sound are part of the HD experience. Try one of the stock mouthpieces or have Carl make you a custom one. Either way, everything is better in HD, and you can find out more at carlhammonddesign.com. If you're enjoying this podcast, I hope you are, I would love it if you would take just a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts to leave a star rating and a review. Doing so will help improve the visibility of this podcast and draw more listeners. When I first tried an Eastman B-flat trumpet, I was blown away by both the playability and the sound. And the more I found out about the company and got to know the people, I knew that this was a company I wanted to have a relationship with. There is a drive for excellence in design and production of every instrument, not just the high-end products. And the proof of this is that the one and only Doc Severinsen helped to design the Eastman beginner trumpet model. I still play that B-flat and have added a spectacular cornet and flugelhorn to my arsenal. You can find out more at eastmanwinds.com. I'd love it if you'd visit the Studio HFL website and sign up for the weekly newsletter. And while you're there, you can also visit the merch page and buy a Studio HFL shirt for yourself and as a gift for someone else. Of course, you can do that at studiohfl.com. My current situation with my C trumpet is a bit ridiculous. My Shire C, which Samantha Lane helped me trial and choose, is the most versatile C I've ever played. The same goes for the new Destino designed by Doc. This horn sizzles when I need it to sizzle and is as smooth as silk when I wear my never mind. Anyway, the line of Shire's trumpets includes the Q series, which are production models, and the custom series. Either way you go, you'll love the sound you get, and you'll also experience exceptional customer service. Find out more at seshires.com. Here's how you can access exclusive content like the interview excerpts. I'd like to invite you to become a part of the Studio HFL community by going to Patreon and choosing from one of the 4 tiers of support. You can help to financially support the show for as little as $36 a year. That's only $3 a month. Benefits include exclusive access to interview excerpts, a behind-the-scenes report, an invitation to be in the room with a guest during an interview, product discounts, and more. You can join the community of faithful supporters by visiting patreon.com/studiohfl. And now, on with the interview. Well, you know, the reason I mentioned Eleanor Brachetti is she celebrated her 90th birthday this June.
Really? Where does she live now?
Just outside of San Francisco. And so we had plans, because Jenny was one of her students through Suzuki, and she was having this big birthday. She was going to have this big birthday celebration. We had plans to fly out there and spend like a week in San Francisco. Of course, all of that fell through. And what they ended up doing was a Zoom meeting.
Oh.
But it was early on in Zoom, and there were a lot of people who had no idea. It's like the first time my mom got a hold of a remote control, you know, and so it was kind of funny. I mean, we finally worked it out here, and they finally worked it out for her birthday. But it's a pleasure to see you and to
Well,
get to
before we
chat
get
with you.
off the topic, Eleanor was really special, and I have two daughters that studied violin, and so we would go to her home, which I think was right off of Meridian, somewhere there in the Governor home area there, someplace. And so we'd go to her home for lessons, and eventually we went to U of I every Saturday morning with the two kids. And there was another woman who taught with her, had blonde hair.
April Cole.
April Cole. What's happened to her?
I don't know. I took string methods from her at UIndy. That's how I know her.
They were really good. The kids were
Yeah.
there for about 3 hours every Saturday morning, and they would. April would teach music theory on the floor with cards and that sort of thing. But you may not know this about me, but I'm so old that I actually studied with Dr. Suzuki. I was one of his American students.
That's fantastic.
I'm a cellist, and when I went to undergraduate school, I went to Stevens Point, University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. And there was this woman by the name of Marjorie Aber who had taught strings in Detroit. And with a group of string teachers, they went to Japan and discovered Suzuki method and brought it back. And then when I was an undergraduate, I was in music ed, so I would teach alongside of her in the campus school. And that all we had at that time were the green books that were violin books. There was no Suzuki cello, no Suzuki harp, piano, flute, none of that. And I was a cellist, so I wrote out Lightly Row, Go Tell Aunt Rhody, Minuet, all of those songs for cello. And I think I probably am the first Suzuki cello teacher in the United States, because it was after that John Kendall came out with the books, the various books at the different level.
Yeah.
But when I taught, it was these green books, and they were all in Japanese. And then at that very same time, which was in the late 60s, we started the American Suzuki Institute in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And Marge was my teacher. We used to go canoeing together. I one time dumped her in the water. So yeah, I have a strong Suzuki background.
Well, that's fascinating. And now he's 11 today. One of my sons is his birthday today. He's 11, but he's just graduating book 2. And of course, we're already listening to book 3. And of course, Hillary Hahn just recorded all the Suzuki violin material. And of course, it's spectacular.
Yeah.
But I've been taking Jack to his lessons and group lessons for the last couple of years. And I've become so enamored with Suzuki that I was going to get back in June, get my certification. They now have Suzuki trumpet certification.
Oh, interesting.
So hopefully it's going to happen again this coming June, and fingers crossed that we'll be able to do that. But I think Suzuki is brilliant. The whole sound before sight concept is.
But the problem is that, and Suzuki method has great criticism because of this.
Oh yeah.
And what he understood and Marge understood so well is that we always learn at 2 different levels. We have oral learning and we have written or visual learning, and they both have to be taught from the beginning on. And that's why Eleanor and April were so good, because what happens is if kids progress quickly and they're playing by ear, they don't learn to sight read. And so sometimes you have players that could sit first chair in an orchestra, but they can't read anything because they can learn so fast in a microsecond. When they've heard it once, they can play it. So reading has to be taught very, very early on, but at a completely different level than what they're doing orally. And so it's a really interesting thing. So therefore, Suzuki method has gotten a bad rap. Do you remember when Suzuki was the concert master at ISO?
Hidetaro, yes.
Hidetaro. Well, I talked to him several times about it. He hated Suzuki method, and he actually studied with Suzuki. But he felt like there were so many students who just had such poor reading capability because of the way teachers were teaching it. But before we get to this other interview, think sometimes I've been a great teacher, sometimes I've been a mediocre teacher, sometimes I've been a terrible teacher, but on occasion I've been a great teacher. And I attribute that to Suzuki. He taught in such a remarkable way. When I knew him, he was about 80 years old, smoked like a chimney. His wife was German, but he, as old as he was, he'd have these little kids and he'd be marching around the room and be up on a chair and down off the chair, and kids would be following him. He'd be laying on his back and playing. He made the holding and the playing of the instrument a natural extension of his body, but he always did it with enormous positivity and fun and curiosity. And when I'm really a good teacher, I know that I attribute a lot of that to him.
So we're gonna get to this, but I want to see how this is gonna relate to or transfer into the children's choir.
Yeah.
Because I have to imagine that there are parallels. There's transference there.
Yeah, enormous parallels. And I have a bridge between Suzuki and children's choir, and that's the Kodaly method. And that helped me a great deal. When I started the children's choir, this is difficult to admit, actually, but I had begun as a cello major and a voice major. And so my first teaching job in the late 60s, early 70s was grade 7th through 12th grade orchestra and choir. So I've always taught both, really. And after I started my master's degree in University of Colorado, my wife and I were going out there in the summers and paying out-of-state tuition. And it was really high. So I said, I need to get residency in the state of Colorado. So I went to the Boulder Valley Schools supervisor and I said, I'm interested in applying for a job. And he said, what do you want to do, choir or orchestra? And I said, I'll do either, because I just want to get a job in this. So he called the next spring and he said, I have a job for you, Henry. And I said, what's that? And he said, we're opening up a new high school. I'd like you to do the orchestra program. So when I went to Colorado, for quite a long time, I was just an orchestra director.
Wow.
I could say only an orchestra director.
Yeah.
I had an orchestra and 2 junior high orchestras. And so that's a long story in itself. But as my life progressed, I ended up back in the Midwest. And there's kind of a crucial year that occurred. And it was in 1986. I was the assistant conductor of the symphonic choir. I had been preparing lots and lots of choirs for the symphony, for John Nelson, and so forth. And I went to John Nelson one day, sat down in his office, and I said, I think I'd like to become a professional orchestra conductor. Do you think I could do that? And he said, no. I picked my jaw up off the floor and said, oh, well, okay. And he said, it has nothing to do with your musical capability. Or he said, you would be a great professional orchestra conductor, but you're too old. And I was 40 years old at the time. And he said, I've been conducting the ISO for 14 years. I had the Juilliard program. I did my debut in New York. He said, what they're hiring right now are young, like the Exxon Arts Endowment conductors, the young 22, 21-year-olds, 23-year-olds. He said, you're my age. And by the time you would go and get the proper training you need to be at that level, you'd be way too old. You'd be unhireable. So I suggest you do something else. So I said, oh, well, what about starting my doctorate at IU? And he said, I think that's a great idea. So he wrote a recommendation. I was accepted in 1986 to the doctoral program in choral conducting in Indiana University. Weirdly enough, that very same time, I get a phone call from a guy named Jack Eaton, who was the dean. And he said, Henry, I've heard about your work with the symphonic choir. Would you like to come and teach at Butler University? And I had to pick myself up off the floor. I hadn't applied or anything. And here was a dean calling me to come and teach. And it was an adjunct position. I was going to come and teach one semester of university choir. I mean, one course per semester. So I did that first semester, just university choir. Second semester, they said, well, would you do a section of conducting? And would you do a madrigal ensemble? And then the second year, Gus Polimas, my colleague, got ill. And so I took his section of choral, of basic conducting. So before I knew it, I was teaching a full-time load. And that continued for, I guess, 27 years.
Were you still doing your doctorate through those years?
Well, that's another story. So what was happening was that spring, the spring before that, I had always thought that children had to be taught how to become musicians, and that at some point in time they would become advanced enough to become a musician. And I'm embarrassed to say, to some degree, that my wife, who teaches elementary vocal music, had been teaching that for a long time. And she had produced lots of great choirs in her elementary school. And so in the spring of 1986, there was an ACDA convention in Indianapolis. And I got this letter. I was conducting a Unitarian church choir. And I got this letter from the director of the Chicago Children's Choir saying, we've been invited to come and sing at the ACDA convention, but we need help with our busing. And would you be willing to homestay our kids? And I thought, well, I don't know anything about children's choirs, and I don't know anything about the Chicago Children's Choir. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the way we bought music, I know this is hard to believe, but I would drive to Chicago, go to Carl Fisher, and spend a full day going through boxes of music, playing in the practice room until I chose the repertoire for the following year. So I said, well, I'm coming up to Carl Fisher. Why don't I stop by your rehearsal, which was in Hyde Park, which is the south suburb area of Chicago. Well, I got lost. And as Obama would tell you, that is not a great neighborhood. It's ghetto. It's like a peninsula around Hyde Park, and it's all ghetto on all three sides, and very high crime area. I got lost. I thought for sure I'm going to be mugged. I can't find my way. Finally, I found the congregation or the Unitarian church there. And I was afraid to get out of the car because there were all these big thug-looking guys around. And so finally I got out, and some of them went right into the church. And I thought, oh, what's going to go on here? And before I knew it, they're all sitting down and singing in a children's choir. They were singing Rayfon Williams, Lyndon Lee. And I sat there with my jaw open and thinking, you know what? This children's choir is the ticket out of this ghetto for these kids. Wow. That choir provided their shoes, the red jacket, their shirt, and it was their way of escaping poverty. And so I said, you bet we'll invite you down. And so the choir came down, sang at ACDA, got a standing ovation, were phenomenal musically. And afterwards, Doreen Rao was awarding them a plaque. And I sat in the back of the room and thought, you know, we don't have anything like that in Indianapolis. Maybe I should, I'm starting my doctorate. I'm going to teach at Butler. Maybe if I could find like 75 kids and start a choir, it would provide a little income for me. And it's something to be good for the city and bring kids from various neighborhoods and religious and social economic traditions together. And that would be a great thing. So the truth was I knew little or nothing about the child's voice. I was professionally trained as a conductor of adult choirs, high school choirs. I conducted middle and high school choirs for years and orchestras. So I did a little trip down to Indiana University to visit with Mary Getze. And she was teaching the child, she had the IU children's choir, and she was teaching children's choir techniques, etc. And I went into her office, sat down on a couch, I'll never forget it, and was there for 3 hours. And I was asking her questions like, what I know about the adult voice, does that also match up what I would do with a child's voice? How is a child's voice different than an adult voice? How would we teach that differently, and so forth? And I left that office that day with a stack about 24 inches high of octavos for me to look through. And I met, but she just passed away actually. Her name was Kathy Smith, and she taught at Butler. And she had a tiny little choir called the Butler University Children's Choir. It's about 30 kids. And so I asked her if, since she was going to be leaving and I was coming the next fall, I wondered if she would recommend those kids, and maybe that could become a nucleus to start the Indianapolis Children's Choir. And she said, well, we need to have lunch. So we went to the garden house at the Indianapolis Museum. Remember that nice little restaurant that used to be there? And she sat down and she looked me square in the eye and she said, before I would do anything, I want to know, are you going to teach fixed dough or movable dough? And I thought, what a weird question to ask. And my background was contrary to what kids really need. When I was an undergraduate, I had Eastman trained music theory instructors, and we learned how to sight read by singing numbers. And then I did a lot of summer work at the at the Colorado Aspen Music Festival, and all my teachers there were from Juilliard, and I learned fixed do. So the way I sight read was either with numbers or fixed do. And I said to her, well, I think I'll probably use fixed do. And she said, well, I don't think I'd recommend kids to your program then, because I think movable do is a better way to teach kids how to sight read. She said, I recommend you do some Kodaly training. Well, at this point, knowing that I wanted to start a choir and knowing that I knew little or nothing about it, I was a sponge. And so in the next year, approximately, I took Kodaly training. I became a certified Kodaly teacher in the next couple of years. At IU, I took all of Mary Gessie's coursework, child voice, how to develop a children's choir. I studied with Jean Ashworth Bartle with the Toronto Children's Choir. I went up to St. Thomas and studied with Joan Gregoric. I went and took the Doreen Rao choral music experience training, became a master teacher. I mean, I had to do some quick learning. And what I found out was that you don't have to wait till you're an adult to become a great musician. That in fact, an 11-year-old child can be an artist, can be a great musician. And that's all a matter of how we approach and how we teach kids. And that takes me back to that Suzuki training. When people would say, do you teach elementary strings? How in the world can you stand all that screeching? Well, guess what? You teach them correctly and they don't screech.
Right.
They make beautiful sounds right from the beginning. You know, when I think one of the most moving experiences I ever had in my life was being in a gigantic gymnasium in Stevens Point in the summer, the American Suzuki Institute. And I think there were over 500, maybe more than that, kids all playing the Bach double violin concerto. You know, it was this glorious sound, and all these little bitty kids, some 4 years old, some 6 years old, some 12, you know, that children have an incredible capability of being artistic. And that has become the foundation, that the way to build tone, the way to build beauty, the way to build phrasing, the way to sing from your heart, the way to be artistically expressive, which I learned back from the Suzuki days, became the cornerstone of what we did in the Indianapolis Children's Choir. They weren't kids in training. We were in the process of being artistic. Even if it was a simple unison song, or even if it was a two-part song, we were going to go as far as we could to be artistic. But I also didn't ignore the fact that they needed to learn to read. And so with that, I created, through the Kodaly method, a curriculum. And then I surrounded myself with strong Kodaly teachers. Ruth Dwyer is really the one who developed the curriculum for ICC, but I'm the one that hired her and wanted her to do that.
Yeah.
and so we knew if we were doing this choir and we were choosing that music, the reason we were choosing it is because those kids were learning one flat, F major, and they were learning G major, one sharp, and that fit into the context. And they were learning Tahiti, which that fit into that context, that all the music that we did fit into a sense of curriculum, because Kodaly teachers have a 3-phase process. They prepare the child to learn, they present the material, and then they reinforce the material. And where most music teachers go wrong is they forget the prepare part. You know, the worst thing you can do is hand a piece of advanced music to a student and say, let's read this in solfege. And they get lost after the 5th syllable and they think, I can't do this, I hate solfege. Well, it's because it wasn't prepared. A child should never have to sing something they're not ready to sing or play something they're not ready to play. That it's all a matter of careful preparation. And I learned a lesson, a really great lesson. I was watching Mary Getzie on Saturdays. I'd observe the IU Children's Choir. And one fall, this is when she was writing a lot of music for the Boosey and Hawkes series. And one fall, she was teaching away, and all of a sudden she stopped suddenly and went, "Full the riddle, all the riddle, hey, ding dong." And the kids looked around, and she just went right on. And they thought, what was that? And then about 2-3 weeks later, she stopped and went, "Full the riddle, all the riddle, hey, ding dong," and just went right on. Didn't ask them to respond, didn't tell them what it was. It was perplexing to them. The year went on, the semester went on. Come February, she handed out a piece called Old Carry On Crow. And when they saw "Full the riddle, all the riddle, hey, ding do," they were so excited. That's what you were doing. Now we know what you were doing. That
Brilliant.
was masterful preparation, because she knew in October that they were not going to be able to do "Full the riddle, all the riddle, hey, ding do" unless they were prepared to do it. And so that's the secret to good teaching, is to know where you're headed, prepare for the learning, teach the learning in an inquisitive way, not jam it down and test them and make them feel inferior, but let it be always a process of joyful exploration. If there's joyful exploration, the learning will always progress.
Mm.
And so, I'm so thankful to those people that helped me. Gene Sinor, the Kodaly instructor, and Mary Getzi and Dr. Suzuki, and all those other people that I learned from helped me blazon a path that I hope, even in spite of the pandemic, will continue.
I'm sure it will. I want to go back to this. Was it Kathy Smith?
Yeah.
And you said, would she recommend? So at some point, did she recommend her kids to you? And so how many students, and what were the age ranges there?
Out of the 35, they were roughly students in the 5th, 6th, 7th grade, I would say. Out of the 35, I think about 25 or so joined the choir. And I still communicate with 3 or 4 of those kids. And this was, 1986. So, in fact, one of those kids is currently teaching at the Interlaken Academy up in Interlaken. Through the years, he's in the high school teaching. One of them, Sybil Roll, has been all over the world. I think she's teaching in Madagascar now and very fluent in French. I mean, these kids have done extraordinary things. But yeah, Kathy and I remain very good friends. She went and taught then at Webster University in St. Louis. And she was really, really great. And so the program grew from there. I didn't know how to start a children's choir. I mean, having never taught one, didn't know where to begin. And at the time I wanted to do this, there were probably, my guess is 8 or 10 in the United States. It was a pretty new phenomenon. There were a couple of boy choirs around, famous boy choirs, Pittsburgh Boy Choir and the American Boy Choir, which had been the Columbia Boy Choir. And there was one in Baltimore, and there was one in Chicago, and just a few scatterings. So I didn't have much of a model to go from. And so I went to the supervisor of music at IPS, and I asked him, how would you start a children's choir? And he said, well, I think what I would do is a festival. What I do is contact all the music teachers in IPS and tell them you want to do a festival and send them out the music and let them kind of learn the music, and then bring them together on one day and have a festival, sing, and then recruit your singers from there. I thought, that's a great idea. So I'm driving home. I know exactly what I'm going to do, until I'm almost home and I go, well, wait a minute. How would I know what kind of music to send them? I don't know these kids from Adam. I don't know what their capability is. If I send music that's way too hard, it'll be totally unsuccessful. If I send music that's way too easy, it'll be totally unsuccessful. How do I know the right kind of music? And then if I happen to hit that mark, if I got the right music, how do I know they're going to learn it in such a way that when they come together, we can create a musical process? Now, that idea is not going to work. So I thought about that for a week or two. I thought, well, if I could get kids to just come for a few days, I could teach the music. And if I'm off the mark, I can get harder music or easier music. I can match up their abilities to the music, like do a choral festival. And so in June of 1986, I had advertised the music teachers. I had meetings with them and encouraged them to recommend kids. And it was unbelievably successful. 204 kids came. And
oh my gosh.
We had a morning session and we had an afternoon session. And it was amazing. We met at the Unitarian Church. We learned music. On Wednesday, all the parents came. We had a big pitch-in. That was allowed then. You could actually eat each other's food. And we sold tickets for a concert, and I reserved the auditorium at the Children's Museum. Well, those tickets sold out like lickety-split. And so I had to schedule 2 performances because we filled the hall up twice. And out of that 204 kids, I think about 185 or something like that auditioned for the choir. It was remarkable. Wow. It was very successful. On Wednesday, the St. Louis Children's Choir came through. Ethlyn Sparfeld did a concert for them so they could see what a children's choir could be. And the parents were excited. Then we opened up auditions, and there were brothers and sisters that wanted to come. And so I think we started with, I don't remember them, 220 or something like that in the very first year. It was bigger than I ever dreamt. I thought I'd be lucky to get 75 kids. Well, then that grew to 340 and then 375. And before I knew it, we were over 1,000. So the program grew very, very quickly, not because of me specifically, but because of the teachers in the area, because of the timing. It was something that was in the right period of time, and because the kids were very successful. And what was weird is that the way I got the funding for the children's choir was right before the Pan Am Games. And I applied the Lilly Endowment through the symphonic choir, because I was on the symphonic choir board, and received $25,000 to start the choir. So it was funded properly in the beginning. And because of that, things could really take off. We then sang the opening ceremonies with the Disney people, 800 singers, at the track for the opening ceremonies of the Pan Am Games and the closing ceremonies, where we sang Back Home Again in Indiana in gospel style with a gospel choir. It was pretty amazing. And then the very next year, the National Music Educators Conference came to Indianapolis, and we prepared and sang that fall at the Hyatt Regency Ballroom for a national audience of music educators. It was called MENC at that time. Mm-hmm. And that took off. We were then nationally known, and it just went from there. I think we sang for 4 or 5 national ACDA conventions, national music librarians, national ORF conventions, national Kodaly conventions. I mean, we just did a lot of singing and traveling after that. It was quite successful.
Well, that's an understatement. Quite successful. I've been so fortunate to actually witness firsthand, because being part of, I just drew a blank, the annual Christmas Angels Sing.
You played that many years.
Yes, and I'm so disappointed. Of course, we're gonna miss this year, but and of course Josh Pedde, who I'm going to talk to tomorrow. Okay. But now I was so glad to be able to perform under your baton, and of course Ruth and Cheryl West, mm-hmm. Yeah, and several others. But not just to be under the baton, but to see how you rehearse. Right? It wasn't just the performance. So I've been able to witness, and I know it's not at the beginning stages of learning these pieces, but after everything's been fine-tuned, but still to be able to witness the relationship from the podium to these kids. Sometimes, 800 kids, or it seems like up there.
Yeah.
And this is not something that you get by somebody coming into the choir at 12, 13, 14 years old. I mean, this is because that relationship started how young? What's the earliest they start?
They start at 9 years old, at 4th grade. And usually they started with my wife, who taught the beginning choir.
But I look at that, and you mentioned earlier, talking about that group in Chicago, and it gave them a sense, gave them shoes, gave them a shirt, gave them a place, you said, out of poverty, but it's community.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, it's a place to belong. And you look at, what a great place to show up, I would think, for an ICC rehearsal, whichever choir it would be in. Yeah. And just to see how well these kids get along with each other, and the joy they have with the music. And that's to me the really remarkable thing, is the joy that these kids have at every stage. I'm sitting there with my trumpet while these little kids, filing behind me, and then your big kids choir. I don't remember the names of all the levels, but
they have lots of different names.
Yeah, but it's just
that you hit it absolutely right. What keeps kids in a choir? Yeah, nice music. Yeah, touring, that's important, but it's actually the close friendships. And so we learned early on that if all you did was rehearse music and sing well, the choir would fall apart, because what really drew those kids together was their relationship. And we had lots of different kinds of kids, all different kinds, but many, many times I would hear from kids, at school, I'm kind of a little out of it. I don't always like the stuff they like, and I'm maybe active in sports or not, but when I'm in my choir, most of the kids don't want to be there. But when I come to this place, I'm with kids who love to sing and they love what I'm doing. And it's funny because I've seen wedding photos. I remember one at Vanderbilt where all 6 female attendants and all 6 male attendants were ICC kids. Even through college, they've remained. And right now, yesterday, I think, was the day of giving, the Tuesday Giving Day.
Yes.
All kinds of alumni talking about how they got involved and why they're involved and how they have lifetime friendships still today. That some of those kids made their closest lifelong friends in that setting, which is just an added benefit to what we did musically.
Yeah, I think about what that does for the kids, but also what does that do for the community? And not just, the donut counties around here, but I mean, it really is Indianapolis and beyond. I mean, you were reaching kids from every, and still are reaching kids from every part of the town.
Yeah, I remember one kid in particular that lived way in a really bad area on East 38th Street. And he'd get on the bus and he'd come in all by himself and he'd get to my office maybe an hour and a half before rehearsal. He'd sit there and do his homework and go through rehearsal. And then he'd wait for the bus. Didn't come by the Butler campus very often. And take the bus all the way home. He'd do that twice a week, every week. It was amazing. We had 2 kids once. The mother drove them from right at the Illinois-Indiana border. And she drove them all the way to Indianapolis twice a week. I mean, it was amazing, the commitment that we would see from these kids. I remember one year we sang for Yuletide, and we sang 21 performances in the month of December. Now, they didn't all sing all 21. They each sang 6. We were rotating. Okay. But even still, what a commitment to with these kids. Yeah, it was amazing. And
so here you are. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, when we went to ACDA, one time it was in Louisville, one time in San Diego, one time in Miami, and what was the last one? There were 4 different ones. San Antonio. Every time we went to sing, those kids earned their own money to go. I mean, it wasn't paid. Now, not all of them. Some of them we helped if they needed help. But the thought that a program would take your entire choir at whatever expense it was to fly to San Antonio, sing, the lodging, the meals, and fly back. And that was done on the backs of those kids and their parents in this community. It was pretty amazing.
I was going to say, here we are. This would be 34 years later, right? You said 86 was the first year for that?
Yeah, you're good at math.
Did you? Well, I did get a degree from Butler, so let's hope so.
When did you graduate?
Well, I like to tell people that college was the best 17 years of my life. So
I was asking, was I there while you were a student?
You were. In fact, I started college in '84. And I finished my master's in 2001. I went back to Butler just in time to finish my degree. But you were there when I started in '93. And I remember, and of course, Stan DeRusha was the orchestra conductor at the time.
Yeah.
But you conducted, and I don't know, you'll remember, of course, if it was the Butler, it must have been a Butler group, but we did Chichester Psalms and something else. And I think we did it at North Church.
I think maybe Haydn Te Deum and Chichester Psalms. I don't remember. Yeah.
Well, I remember the Bernstein for sure.
Yeah.
But what I remember is, of course, I think the trumpet has a sustained written A. Yeah. And you were waiting to release. You were waiting for me to take a breath, and of course, I was looking at you thinking, how long do you want to go on this? I can keep going.
That's a treacherous little path there. Yeah.
But that is, that's ingrained in my memory because that was such a treat. And of course, Stan, now you talk about preparation. Stan was excellent at preparing that orchestra for whatever piece.
Yeah.
And I credit him with I feel like I've become a very good orchestral. I'm a responsible musician. I know how to prepare. I know how to behave. Most of the time I know how to behave. But yeah, that was, and I don't remember the year. It must have been mid-90s that happened. But it was a great experience. But But yeah, so 34 years. Did you ever imagine that it would reach this scope?
No, I never did. And it was never my goal, actually. The odd thing is, I've said this so many times, and maybe this is changing now that I'm retired. I do more reflection than I had before, but I think they're personality types that live always in the future. I've had a lot of young conductors come to me and how do I plan my career like yours? How can I get to do all states? How can I do these things? How did you plan all this? I said, oh, I never did. I never, ever did plan it. And then there are all these people that think about all the wonderful things they've done and they live in their past.
Mm.
Well, I think great music making happens in the present. And the odd thing is that it's been an enormously wonderful journey, but I think I lived in the present the whole time. It's so strange that sometimes I'll see, well, this is a great piece. I ought to do this piece. And I find out, oh, I did it 8 years ago. I don't even remember that I did it. That happened to me last fall. I conducted the Durfley Requiem at Florida International University in Miami. And we needed a companion piece so we didn't end the concert so sad. And so I said, well, let's do the Randall Bass Gloria. I just happened to see it on YouTube. So I ordered it. And Javier Mendoza, who was my former student at Butler, said, well, you actually did that when I was a student at Butler. And I said, whoa, we did it in Rejoice. Okay, I'd forgotten. You were so anyway, your question was, did you ever imagine that this would be what it, and the answer is no. I just kind of went with it year by year, facing the challenges, facing the successes, and loving the kids, feeling sad when they left, and meeting new faces every year. It was just a journey for me, but I think I enjoyed the presence of it throughout that journey.
You know, I spoke to Adam Bodoni yesterday, and I'm talking to Susan Kitterman tomorrow because you know these two programs, and you know, of course, there's the symphonic choir, but I mean, these two programs, so focused on youth, have given so much to the community.
The weird thing is that my daughter Anya played in Susan's orchestra, and her daughter sang in my choir.
Oh, that's funny.
At the same time. And you know, you were talking about playing Chichester. Well, I met Adam a few years ago when he got involved with what was the New World. Now I think it's called Indianapolis Youth Orchestra or something.
Yep.
Anyway, Adam's a sweet guy. We were talking and he said, well, you know, I actually played under your baton. And I said, oh, you did? And he said, yeah, do you remember that time we did Mozart Requiem right after 9/11? And I went, oh my God, I'll never forget. He said, yeah, I was in the trombone section.
Wow.
And also he did Chichester and he did Haydn Te Deum. I think 1 or 2 or 3 years, Susan and I would pick 2 major works and she'd conduct one and I'd conduct the other. So yeah, there's a long, wonderful parallelism there. Well,
but I mentioned Adam too, because not only is he now, of course, leading the IYO, but he is one of those who graduated, who aged out of one of these programs. And, you know, he talks about how special it is. And of course, you see that when people, they realize it's their last performance with the ICC or the IYO. But then you get to see the opportunities for them to return, and my goodness, how many people return, like at Angels Sing or Rejoice, right? You get the opportunity to come and join the choir. Yeah, it's got to be a hard thing to leave behind.
Well, you know, I'll never forget one tour. You know, the year would end and they'd sing Friends and they'd have the graduation ceremony, but then we'd go on tour that summer. So the real last concert would be the last concert of tour. And I'll never forget, one year we had this great European tour and we ended up in Paris and we were singing at the American church in Paris. And we were singing pretty joyful music. It was great music. And all of these older kids were boo-hooing. They're all crying. And the audience is going, why are those kids all crying? Well, it was their last concert. That's what it was. You know, it gets pretty emotional to leave.
The people that you brought alongside you through the years, you mean, you've already mentioned Ruth, and she's still with the group.
She is. She's been there longer than I was now.
And, you know, of course, Cheryl West, bless her heart. I just think she was
a remarkable person. I learned so much from her. You know, what I really learned from her is you can be happy and you can be nice and you can care and you can have an impact on kids. But until you just love them so much
Hmm.
that they think of you almost as a parent, that's when you
Mhm.
really change their lives. And she did that
Mhm.
with those kids. They still to this day, on her birthday, I see all kinds of posts, and they called her Mama West, and they talk about sparkles and all that. I mean, she really,
Mhm.
really changed lives in a big,
Mhm.
big way. It's
Mhm.
such a tragic loss.
Yeah. Uh, when did Josh become part of the picture?
You know, Josh studied with me for 15 years. Can you imagine? Who's that?
Yes.
You could be a sitar player in India in that time. You know? Well, the way it happened, and he'll tell you this story too, but he came to Butler as a freshman and I met him. I think he might have been in my ME 101 class or whatever.
Mm.
And he came down, I think in the fall, and said, Mr. Leck, I've seen your rehearsals and I want to be a children's choir director. And I said, well, that's great, Josh. You'd be a fabulous director. And he said, I want to learn how to conduct from you. And I said, well, that's great. When you're a junior, you can take basic conducting, and the second semester you can take choral conducting. He said, no, I want to learn now. I said, well, that's pretty odd. I don't normally take private students until they've had 2 basic
Mhm.
semesters of conducting, but you really want to learn. He said, yes, I really do. So I took him on as a private student.
Mhm.
So he studied with me that year, the next year. When it came to his junior year, he tested out of basic conducting.
Well.
He had to play every example in the Huntsberger book, and he did that. I mean, he
Mhm.
knew that stuff. And so he became a senior, music ed, student taught. And then there was an opening for a graduate assistantship at Butler. I said, well, do you want to be my graduate assistant? He said, I'd love that. So he stayed for 2 more years, got a master's degree at Butler. Then he went and taught in Zionsville for 5 years.
Mhm.
But during that time, he was at my side the whole time as my assistant conductor. And so he would do a piece here, a piece there, pretty soon a small concert here. And eventually then he took over one of the 2 choirs primarily. And so after 5 years of teaching, I could see my way to bringing him on full time. And so he came on full time. And the reason I brought him on was to create some whole new initiatives. And we created um, a, a teachers council so that we'd have better communication with music teachers, doing more outreach with underserved kids and so on. He did all kinds of things, started new programs, initiated this and that. And it was about that time I was thinking about when should I retire. And I sometimes thought, I'm never going to retire. I'm just going to die standing on the podium. I'm going to do that the rest of my life. And I thought about it to some degree. And actually, a friend of mine who was born on the same month of the same year in the same week, she had retired. And she said, Henry, don't cheat yourself of what you can do in your life once you've retired. And so, about that time, we had I think, an independent study done by the Lilly Endowment of the organization. And they talked a lot about planned succession because what the most vulnerable time for any organization, if it's founder led, is when the founder leaves. And I saw it happen left and right because about the time I was thinking of retiring, so were a whole bunch of other children's choir directors. And sometimes they would retire but not let go. So the person that came in smothered and couldn't succeed and couldn't make changes. Other times they hadn't thought about it, hadn't prepared, the organization just fell apart.
Mhm.
And so I thought, I really need to do this right because I'm probably only going to do it once. And that's plan my succession. And so about 3 years in advance, Josh knew that he was going to be my successor.
Mhm.
The board had approved his succeeding me. So for the last year or so, he really did the bulk of my work because
Mhm.
I wanted him to see the successes and failures and be able to think about what the future would bring. And I didn't really know what he would do with the choir, but I knew absolutely that it was essential that once I said it was his choir, I had to get the hell out of the way. I had to leave.
Mhm.
And I didn't have to leave the city exactly, but I chose to. I did my last concert on April 30th, and May 3rd, I moved into a new home in Bloomington.
Wow.
So I got out of town. And to this day, I mean, Josh, and he calls me his best friend, and I think it's a mutual friendship. He and I
Mhm.
really love each other so much. But I'm very careful not to give him advice unless it's asked for. And he's not very often asked me very much about musical things because he's making those decisions and he's making them well. But often he's come to me with administrative challenges, like what do I do about this personnel issue, or what do I do about this budgeting issue? What do you think about this programmatic change? Do you think I should change the name of some of the choirs? I mean, what about outfits? What if we changed outfits? You know, he's asked me lots of questions, and where he's asked, I've given him advice. And so hopefully I've done that right. And I think I have, because of all the people I've seen trying to figure out what to do during this pandemic, he has been the most flexible and the most creative of any that I've known. And part of that is that he changed some things when I left. For instance, I insisted that when you get kids there twice a week, they learn more than twice as much, because you have the regularity. It's like, do you practice piano a half hour every day, or do you practice one time for an hour and a half? You know, that regularity, reinforcement, they grow faster. But what he was seeing was that some parents were growing fatigued from driving from wherever they lived in Fishers or Greenwood or Beech Grove or wherever to the Butler campus twice a week was wearing on them. So almost immediately he created a system where they did online learning one night and they did in-person learning the second night, which was ideal for, I mean, you almost think it was planning for a pandemic, you know, that so the kids had responsibility, but the parents only had to come there one night a week, and it was a little longer rehearsal, and they had to keep both nights open. And so right before a Christmas concert or whatever, they'd come for 2 nights. But because of that kind of forward thinking, and because he's younger than I am and he has enormous technical, you know, capability, I would have had trouble teaching virtually, figuring out how to get kids learning music and being responsible and being interactive, you know, on the nights that they weren't in the building. He was able to figure all that out and do it effectively. And so now he's come up with all kinds of creative ways to keep the program going. I think the program is smaller now than it was before, and he's worried about that. He said, I mean, Henry, well, how do I keep up your legacy? And I said, Josh, it's not my legacy, it's now your legacy. And if you can make that choir program profitable and successful and achieve the artistic levels you want to achieve, and you have 1/3 the kids for now, that's absolutely fine. We're not about numbers as much as we are about the quality of experience. And so I support him fully, and I think he's done incredible things, really incredible things.
Well, you know, and I can speak to having played under his baton as well, and more than a capable conductor. I mean, and not just conductor. I mean, he's so expressive. It's not just, you know, making a pattern up there. I mean, he really, and again, that relationship from the podium to the kids, I see that just as I saw that between you and the kids. And I think, and I've seen this too, you know, in the changing of the guard, as it were. Yeah, there's always a dip.
Yeah.
But no, I'm thrilled. Of course, the pandemic, who knows what's going to come out of this, but I'm thrilled to see that he's, you know, at the helm now. And you know, was he the obvious choice?
Yes.
For that?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
You know, some people might have said, well, you'd have been much better off to do a national search and bring in the highest powered replacement you could bring. But I wasn't as concerned about numbers, or how do I say this? I was concerned about retaining some culture that was already there. And to bring in somebody new that was maybe demanding, but had a completely different personality and approach, it would have thrown the program sideways. But while Josh is very innovative and chooses interesting music, a lot of what he does has been consistent. He's been very wise about changing little things, but retaining consistent things. So the program didn't suddenly turn from green to orange, but it has had little shades of alteration, which I think have been good choices.
Well, and he's been a part of Indianapolis. So there's that part, I think, that's important as well. I mean, just as much as you were from Indianapolis, and, you know, this is home. This was home.
You bring in a Boston person and it would be very different for a while.
Right.
Yeah, his wife was an ICC singer. He met her because of ICC. His mother-in-law is the managing financial person of the organization. So there's a lot of, what do I call, familial connection.
Yes. So let's talk about retirement, which you have and you haven't. I mean, you're just as
It,
busy now, right? I
Well,
mean,
I really thought when I retire, nobody's going to want to hire me because I'm past tense. And actually the opposite occurred. And my advice to many people who retire is be careful. Don't take so much on. I found out I was traveling more and conducting more and away from home more, um, and doing way too much. You know, the stuff was coming at me left and right. And so over the period of the last 4 years, I was trying to find a way to wean myself of these professional obligations. And as an example, I was conducting at Eastman School of Music on March 6th of this year. I returned on the 7th, and the pandemic hit in the
next
next
week.
week.
Yep.
And I was ill for 2 weeks. I don't know if I had COVID or not, but the guy I was working with went in the hospital with COVID.
Oh.
And so I missed the Music for All festival that was mid-March, and they had half the choirs weren't able to come, and the other third of them were sent home. They had to stop the festival in the middle. And then the following week, I was supposed to be at Carnegie Hall, and that was canceled. So everything came to a screeching halt, and I've not conducted since. I've done lots of other things, but I just yesterday got a thing from Minnesota Allstate. They want to know, instead of doing it in April of 21, will I do it in April of 22? And I had a booking to do Carnegie Hall March 22nd of next year. And now Carnegie is closed through the end of March. So I have very few bookings. And I was just saying to my wife last night, I think maybe I should contact them and say, you have enough time, find someone else to do that Minnesota Allstate, because I'll be 76 in 22, and I don't think they need a 76-year-old man on an Allstate podium. You know, let some younger people do that have need the experience and have the capability. So one of the things that I've always wanted to do with my life was to paint. I've loved the visual arts, but I've never had the time. And as soon as I got here, which was in May, I had bookings throughout the summer and the ICC tour and the IYC tour and so on. But starting that fall, I started taking painting classes, and I've still taken them. I have a class tomorrow night, and I now have some terrible paintings. Most of them actually are terrible. Some that are sort of good, some that are pretty good, and a few that are really great. As an example, I was totally shocked. Last week, I went up to Indianapolis. There's a place called the Harrison Center. It's kind of on North Delaware. And there's a show there called I'm a member of the Indiana Plein Air Painters Association. Plein air is a French word that means outdoors. So I paint outdoors every week. And I belong to this. And they requested paintings from members. So I sent a painting up, and it's hanging there. Well, my wife and I went down, and there are probably 50 paintings or so. And I noticed they put a little red dot on a painting when it sells. And so I saw about 6 or 7 red dots. And I'm walking along. Also, I noticed one of my paintings sold
Fantastic.
for $625. I couldn't believe it. So I actually now, I've really tried to keep track of paintings I have done. Some I've given away. I've given 3 or 4 of the ICC for fundraisers, for auctions and so on. And I've given some to relatives and to friends, and I've sold some. I have some in a gallery. In fact, I'll be in 2 galleries in Bloomington starting this next month, but try to keep track of them. So I've kind of started a cataloging system, and I've put them on a website, which is henryleck.com. So there are about now, I think they're not all my paintings are there, but there are about 96 paintings. There, some are for sale, some aren't available, some are already sold. But that's become a passion in my life now. I paint regularly.
Watercolor, oil, both?
Just oil. I really love oil paint, mainly because you can paint terribly and just walk away for a day and come back or 2 and paint right over it and fix it. With watercolor, you crunch it up and throw it away and start over.
Right.
And I figure it's been hard enough for me to learn one medium, I should say. So maybe someday I'll adventure into gouache or watercolor or acrylic. But right now I'm just an oil painter.
What about on the musical side? What about arranging and composing?
I've never been much of a composer. I've been sort of half-assed. Are you allowed to say that word on the radio?
Well,
Half
yeah.
arranger. So I publish a lot of pieces. I think I maybe have 800 or so with Hal Leonard and another 600 or 800 with Kodaly. And what I mainly am good at is editing. What I get typically 120 manuscripts a year, and I take them in, I catalog them on an Excel spreadsheet, the name of the composer, the composition name, the voicing of it, when I received it, the email, etc. And then I kind of rate them. And typically what I will do is shrink that list of 120 down to about 50. And then I meet with Hal Leonard people and we shrink that to about 30. And I publish about 30 a year. I have written some pieces, like the main anthem for Music for All is called, I wrote the anthem for that. I don't remember what the name of it is now, but I think it's called Music for All. That's the name of it. But so I've arranged folk songs and stuff like that, but mainly I edit pieces for other composers. And I can usually tell if a piece is inappropriate in terms of language versus the difficulty of the music. For instance, somebody will write this really complex 4-part treble piece about daisies and dancing through the flowers, or some children's nursery rhyme, and I go, these things don't fit. This is music for a middle school kid, and they don't like nursery rhymes, so you need to find challenging text for them. So I can usually tell if a piece is too long or too short, if it doesn't go anywhere, or if it's too trite. And then what I'll sometimes do is ask them to modify it. This is a 6-minute piece. It's going to be too long to print and too boring in a concert. So reduce it to 3.4 minutes or something like that. That it'll make it more marketable. And then what I have done successfully in the past was get it into print and then promote it. I'll go out and do reading sessions at state conventions and national conventions and talk about logical ways you can use this piece pedagogically, how it can teach certain elements, etc. So the odd thing, though, is that with the pandemic, none of last spring's pieces got promoted or sold. Oh. So all of my editing stuff is kind of on hiatus right now until we can get the choral world back on its feet again.
Yeah, well, and the instrumental world as well. I mean, we're all in limbo at the moment.
Exactly right.
So I want to wrap up a little bit, but before we do that,
you want to ramp up or wrap up?
No, wrap up.
Okay. And another highlight with ICC is that one time we produced our own opera, and it was an undertaking like I've never thought I'd ever do or think of, but has a long story. But Mel and Bren Simon lost their son, and they were talking with the rabbi and said, we'd like to do something to honor our son. And the Rabbi Sasso said, well, my son composes music. Maybe you should have an opera written and dedicate it to Max. And so we met several times with Bren, and she not only commissioned the composer, David Sasso, to write the piece, for 200 kids, she had every costume hand sewn, including custom shoes in St. Petersburg, Russia. And all those were sent in crates. She had the set design. We hired someone to design a set and build it for Clues Hall. And we hired a professional orchestra in the pit. And I don't know ultimately what she paid, but it was close to $200,000, I think, for the production of this opera. And we performed it that one weekend, twice or 3 times, and that was it. It was only done once. But Michelle Jarvis, who was in the dance department, then moved on to associate dean and so on. She's still in administration at Butler. She did all the choreography for it, and it spent endless nights rehearsing and all of it. It was very exciting and very incredible. And I'll tell you one last story, and that is the first time we ever were invited to ACDA to perform nationally was at San Antonio. And we did maybe the most phenomenal program I've ever put together before or since. It had contemporary Canadian music. It had a Renaissance art song. It had 8-part Randall Thomas piece in it. I mean, it was everything. And it was a phenomenal performance. And I was so thrilled after the last one that I went off stage and I hugged every kid as they came off the stage. And they said, well, they're still clapping. There's a standing ovation. And I went back out, and I think they said there was a 13-minute standing ovation for that performance. And it was and people to this day still talk about that performance. And it's I have a recording of it, which is terrible. It's a terrible recording, but honest to God, it was probably the best programming that we ever did, and some of the best singing that the choir ever did. Now, embarrassing moments, I guess I've had plenty, but one time I remember, this isn't the children's choir, but I conducted Rejoice every year for 27 years. And one time I remember in Clues Hall, the men's chorus, which is a lot of men, were singing Betelehemu, which is a really strong African piece. Well, I had just finished conducting another piece, and I went right on to it, and I brought them in, but I hadn't given them a pitch. And
is that important? Yeah.
And I went, oops. And I gave them a pitch, and then we went on. But I thought, oh my gosh, that was embarrassing. So I've had a few of those moments.
Well, as far as recordings go, would it be possible to share maybe some of the things that you've mentioned? Would it be possible to share some of those?
Well, ICC has a whole library of recordings. I think maybe while I was there, I did 8 or 10 CDs, and those are now copywritten by ICC. So that's a Josh question.
Okay.
But I'm sure he wouldn't mind sharing some pieces off those CDs.
Terrific. And it just occurred to me too, we didn't even talk about Canadian Brass and the association with them.
Yeah.
And I've become very good friends with Ronnie Rahm, and we text, and I'm good friends with Aaron, one of his sons.
Yeah.
But
what's the name of the tuba player?
Chuck Dallenbach.
Chuck Dallenbach.
And he's still there.
He's still there. And he was born in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. His dad was a band director, I believe. And he grew up there. And I was born like 12 miles away in Merrill, Wisconsin. We have that in common.
I thought he was a Canadian.
I don't know that. Well, we have lived in Canada, but he was born in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, I believe.
Wow.
Fabulous group. And that was a remarkable experience to record with them, in Airborne. And
was that just a one year?
Yes. What happened was I became friends with Emily Crocker, and she was friends with Canadian Brass because they had published instrumental arrangements, but there were some Christmas carols that hadn't been published. So I actually have a Canadian Brass mini series of choral pieces that were published by Hal Leonard. And so it was through her that I got to know them. And we then decided, well, we should record some of these carols and let's put a CD together with the Canadian Brass. They were gracious to do that.
Well, I've talked to Gene Watts since then, and I'm trying to get an interview with Chuck. Fred Mills, of course, passed away.
The trumpet,
yeah. Well, okay. And so, and the piccolo trumpet, right? And so the thing is, those Canadian Brass arrangements, those are not something you can just sit down and read. I mean, but those guys, of course, made it sound so easy. It's still fun to sit down and try to play them.
We've done a whole bunch of those thing. Christmas Tree and Angels we've heard on high, and there are a whole bunch of pieces we've done.
Henry, I want to say this. First of all, it's a pleasure to know you, and to have not just have spoken with you today, but to have worked with you, and to witness who you are and what you can do. But I also want to say thank you for everything you've contributed and still contribute to Indianapolis. I think it's phenomenal.
Well, I appreciate that. And the feeling is mutual. I always felt, and I've said this many times, I always felt like Indianapolis supported the choir. They supported everything we did. And Lillian Dowman from the beginning and all the way through, and Crystal DeHaan, and the mayors, and we've sung for so many of the governor's inaugurations and mayors. I mean, the city has been enormously supportive, and I've been grateful for that.
Did they ever give you a key to the city?
No,
Oh, well, we're going to have to have to talk to somebody
but
about that.
I am a Sagamore of the Wabash, and I'm
Oh,
was it outstanding Indiana citizen. I've gotten
mm,
enough awards to keep me going for a long time.
yeah.
I'm an Indiana living legend, and I got it right after Mayor Mitch Daniels, and
Mhm.
he said, "Well, there were two requirements: you had to be living and you had to be present." He said, "I'm glad I fulfilled both." Yeah,
Yeah,
uh, so
yeah.
it's been a good run.
Well, congratulations on a spectacular career,
Thanks, Larry. Thanks for all you
and
do.
well,
We'll
thank you very much. So, well, all right. Take care. All right. Thank you. Bye bye. Hey, thanks for joining me today for my interview. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to hear more, you can visit patreon.com/studioHFL. By becoming a supporter, you can have access to content that is exclusively available to my Patreon patrons, which would include excerpts from interviews. I'd also like to remind you to visit Apple Podcast and leave a star rating and a review, and don't forget to follow me on social media. Thanks again for being here and listening, and I hope you come back for another interview next time around.